Thanks very much, Raj and Jay, for organizing this interesting event and for everyone else for joining us. So Giulio and I will present a paper that we've written on the distributional impacts of air travel taxes, for which we at least partly used the Understanding Society survey. So the paper was, and the research for it was funded by the UKRI Centre for Research on Energy Demand Solutions. So the reason why we are interested in air travel taxes and the distributional implications of those is that air travel is increasing, and so hence emissions from air travel are increasing and make a growing impact on climate change. While actually air travel is quite difficult to mitigate in some ways, sort of to make more efficient. So therefore, we are interested in, what sort of policies can be used to disincentivize air travel. But of course, we always need to be interested, I think, in the justice implications of any climate change policies. You mentioned the just transition in the introduction as well, Raj, and I think that is really, really important. So in contrast to motor fuel and domestic energy, there are actually currently no, at least not internationally, any taxes on aviation fuels due to the 1944 Chicago Convention. It has to be said, though, that the UK has the air passenger duty, but the air passenger duty only applies to flights that leave the UK, so it doesn't include all the other flights that come into the UK, and hence obviously excludes a lot of flights. So which data and methods do we use? We use the Living Cost and Food Survey from 2014 to 2018, the Secure Access version. And that version has information about the flight destination country. So we can basically estimate the distance of the flight and then apply emission factors from DEFRA to estimate flight emissions. And we used Understanding Society, the 2018-19 version, to examine characteristics of frequent flyers, because Understanding Society has questions around air travel in its environmental modules. So let's first of all have a look at how much do flights actually contribute to households' carbon footprints. So on the right side panel, you can see that if we look at all flights make up about 8% of households' carbon footprints. But this increases quite a lot for households who have one or more flights, and then for households who have frequent flights, so basically two or more flights per year. So this is how we define frequent flights. Frequent flights are any flights that are more than one flight per year. And for those households, actually flights make up 28% of their carbon footprint. So this is quite a considerable proportion of their carbon footprint. And hence, I think another reason why we need to be interested in air travel emissions. They can very quickly contribute a lot to your carbon footprint once you actually fly, and especially if you fly frequently. So let's look then at air travel inequality. Here we can see a Lorentz curve for flight emissions, and we can see emissions are highly unequally distributed. So the top 10% of flight emitters contribute 60.8% of all flight emissions in the UK, whereas the bottom 80% of flight emitters only contribute 16.1% of flight emissions. So this is a big inequality. We could add here, sort of out of interest, how does the UK compare to other European countries? So flight participation is actually higher in the UK than in many other European countries, because the UK is an island. And so we assume that inequality would be even higher in other European countries because participation is lower, which means inequality will be higher. So this sort of just for context, this is already quite unequal in the UK, but like I said, in other countries, it will be even more unequal. We can also look at inequality of air travel emissions over income groups. So here we see flight emissions for all flights and for frequent flights over income deciles. And we can see, again, they're very unequally distributed with higher emissions for higher income groups. If we look at all flights, households in the top income decile emit 7.5 times as much as households in the lowest income decile. And when we look at frequent flights, households in the top income decile have 15 times as much emissions as households in the lowest income decile. So in other words, frequent flights are even more unequally distributed than all flights. And we could actually already see this on the previous slide. And I should have mentioned this because we have two curves here. So one for all flights and one for frequent flights. So the frequent flight curve is even more unequal. Okay, so the inequality of flight emissions matters obviously for understanding the distributional impacts of air travel taxes. This is why we looked first of all at the inequality. So now I'm moving on to explain about how we modeled air travel taxes and the distributional impacts of those. So we looked at four different types of flight taxes. Only one of those is actually existing in the real world, which is the UK air passenger duty. This one charges between £6 and £91 per flight leg, depending on the flight distance and also the flight class. We assume here economy class because the living cost and food survey. Sorry, I wanted to say only covers private, so like leisure flights. But I need to double check that one point. But basically, we assumed economy class. Then we have three types of taxes that we modeled, which are not existing in the real world. The first one is a flat rate tax on flight emissions of £50 per ton of CO2. The second one is a frequent flyer levy, where the price increases with each number of flight. So this is modeled on a proposal by the New Economics Foundation and We Are Possible. This one charges £25 on the second return flight, and then this charge increases by £10 per each additional flight. And then the final model 4, combines in a way models 2 and 3. We call it the frequent air miles tax. And this one charges £50 per ton of CO2 for the first flight, and then an additional £50 per flight per ton for each additional flight. So in other words, the charge per ton gets higher with each additional flight. And we did these models both including and excluding the first flight to basically make all these models comparable to the frequent flyer levy, which automatically excludes the first return flight. So the results I'm showing here all exclude the first return flight. So let's look at the distributional implications of these taxes. We calculated the tax burden as a percentage of household income. And we can see in both of these panels that all these flight taxes are progressive in the sense that they put a higher burden on higher income groups compared to lower income groups. So the first panel expresses the outcomes as the tax burden as a percentage of income, and the lower panel shows the tax burden as a multiple of what the highest income decile pays. So in the lower panel, we can see even more clearly that lower income groups pay less than the higher income groups. The frequent air miles tax is the most progressive of all of these taxes. So this is the top line here in the top panel. And the air passenger duty, which is the light gray line at the bottom here, is the least progressive. So it's nearly neutral in distributional terms. And now I'm going to hand over to Giulio, who did the analysis with the Understanding Society data to understand who is actually affected by these types of taxes by looking at frequent flyers.
Hello. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. All right.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, brilliant. So we'll present the Understanding Society analysis. And what we did was to use the question on air travel on the flights people had taken over the last 12 months, private flights, in order to try and identify who are the frequent flyers, that is, people who had 2 or more return flights over the last 12 months, and which is who are the people who would be affected actually in practice by a frequent flyer levy. And we did find a positive, in regression models, we did find a positive association between frequent flying and a range of classic socioeconomic status factors such as higher income, higher education, being in employment. So that was pretty much expected, but also, interestingly, an association with some other factor which may raise some social inequality concerns, such as being a first-generation migrant, particularly recent first-generation migrant who has been in the UK for less than 10 years, having friends and family abroad, and being a young person. But also there is, interestingly, frequent flying is associated both with living in London, which is sort of expected, net of other factors, but also with living in some of the more peripheral regions of the UK, in the constituent nations of Scotland and Northern Ireland, that might also raise some question about whether these people need to fly, for example, to London more frequently, raise questions of territorial cohesion and so on. But mostly the big picture here is that mostly a frequent flyer levy would burden well-situated groups, but there are some concerns regarding some particular groups, such as first-generation migrants. And in order to illustrate that, in the next slide, we have done a sort of mental experiment with numbers, which is called modeling the predicted probabilities technically. But in practice, what it means that we have imagined 2 profiles of persons, one of them very, very local. So a person with no migration background, going back to their grandparents, no friends outside of the local area, no family abroad, so a very, very local British person, and then someone who's very, very international, like a recent first-generation migrant with lots of friends outside of the local area and close family members abroad. And those are the 2 lines, the solid line for the local person and the dotted line for the very international one. And then we see how likely they are, depending on income, on the x-axis, to be a frequent flyer. And we find that for the very local person, this ranges between around 15% probability for the lowest income band to around slightly less than 40% for the richest among them in the top income quintile. But for the very international person, it is much higher than that. In fact, it's like between 40% and 80%, depending on income. And that implies that even a very poor, very international person is more likely to be a frequent flyer than a very rich local person, which is an interesting thing to think about, to illustrate that there is not just the income dimension, but we must keep in mind that we are talking about a very small group here. First-generation migrants are less than 1% in the UK. Recent ones would be even less than so. Just because of the nature of migration flows to the UK, these people tend not to be in the lowest income quintiles. They tend to be relatively middle class or more than that. So we're talking about a hypothetical person that in practice there is very few of them, but it just illustrates that in principle there might be some social inequality issues there to keep into consideration. And I'll hand over to Milena for the conclusion.
Great, thanks very much, Giulio. So that was the findings about who is going to be most affected by frequent flyer levies. In the paper, we also, for context, did some calculations in terms of how do the distributional impacts of flight taxes compare to those of other carbon taxes, because obviously carbon taxation is quite a frequently used measure, whether it's indirect or direct. And the fairness implications are really important here. So basically, we modeled a £50 per ton tax on total emissions, home energy, motor fuels, and flights. And what we can see in these graphs here is that all other taxes except the flight taxes are highly regressive. So again, we can see the tax burden as a percentage of household income. We can see that for total emissions, and then the sort of dark gray line is home energy, and this is motor fuels. For all of these taxes, low-income households pay more than high-income households as a percentage of their income. In the bottom panel, we can see that even more clearly, where the tax burden is expressed as a multiple of what the 10th income decile pays. And here we can actually see most clearly that the tax on home energy is the most regressive one, while, for example, motor fuels is already much flatter than the other types of taxes, still regressive, but much more flat, which I think is partly due to, not everyone having a car in the first place, and car ownership is quite skewed with income as well. And then the green line, the flight tax, it's the only one where low-income households pay less than high-income households. And like I said, so the underlying reason for that is just simply how these types of emissions are distributed in society and across income groups. So home energy, for example, is much more evenly distributed. It's much more of a necessity, whereas flights are much more unequally distributed, and it's more of a sort of luxury type consumption good. And hence we see these different distributional impacts. So to conclude then, we wanted to propose some policy implications. In the paper, we conclude that when we compare these different types of carbon taxes, air travel taxes are distributionally neutral or progressive and can therefore be defended from a social justice perspective, whereas the other types of taxes are more problematic. They tax necessities and are highly regressive. There is a caveat for air travel taxes in terms of their potential effectiveness. So if we look at a flat rate tax, a lot of research actually finds that the income elasticity for flight taxes, so basically how strongly do people respond to a tax measured on or based on how their income would change, that income elasticity is actually lower for high-income households compared to low-income households. And so basically, high-income households would respond less to such a tax, whereas it's actually exactly that group who we would like to target, right? Because they are the ones who fly most and fly most frequently. So there might be limitations in effectiveness. The frequent flyer levy actually tries to address exactly that issue, because the price per flight increases with each flight. So this creates a larger disincentive for frequent flights. So the hope would be that frequent flyer levies maybe are more effective than a flat rate air travel tax. As Giulio has explained, there are some distributional issues, even with flight taxes, because flight taxes, especially when it comes to frequent flyer levies, do burden some people in low-income groups, especially young people and first-generation migrants. And what we can do to compensate those groups is a little bit limited, because compensating first-generation migrants directly might be quite administratively cumbersome and also intrusive. Stay Grounded has proposed a system where people could apply for a higher contingent of free flights, for example, based on a family crisis overseas, but that might also be associated with stigma and is not so easy to administer. Another option could be to increase benefits for low-income groups, which could then indirectly also cover and compensate these groups that we mentioned here. And in more general terms, I think one important take-home message is that we just need to disincentive air travel more generally, or incentivize alternative ways of travel. So, for example, make the train system in Europe more attractive, have better and more frequent connections, and most importantly, change the pricing structure, because as probably many of you have noticed, if you compare prices for train connections in Europe, and especially between the UK and Europe versus versus flights, the train connections will in all likelihood be more expensive, especially if you get closer to the travel date. And so at the moment, train travel is really disincentivized through the pricing structure. And this could be an important measure to address if we wanted to reduce short-haul flights. Okay, we leave it here, and we are very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you.